Hello, Motivation SIG. I'm here with Dr. Joshua Rosenberg, who is an assistant professor of STEM education at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research focuses on how to engage learners to think and learn about data science in science education settings. He's also a highly active researcher who most recently received both an NSF and an NIH grant this August, even during a pandemic. So today we'll be discussing how to navigate the research world during this time. So thank you so much for being here. And I guess we can get started.
Thank you for the chance to talk, and thank you for the kind introduction. I think some people maybe have done more impressive things than their biographies suggest, and others sound best when others are so generous to introduce them in certain ways. So thanks for the way generous introduction.
Of course. So our first question for you is, how has your research changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And that's just a general overall question.
So generally overall, I took some, well, let me say three different things. So the first is an example of how my research changed. The second is an example of how my research continued along the same path. And the third is kind of a piece of advice to myself mostly, but maybe also to others. So first, I have experience doing data science kind of research. And I think of data science as being characterized by using data that was created for any number of purposes, for the purpose of asking and answering some kind of research question. So sort of using data in a creative, out-of-the-box kind of way. And so a project I started with a number of colleagues was to try to look on US school districts' websites to try to understand broadly their response to the pandemic. So were they closing? Early on, that seemed like a very salient question. Later on, every district, or every school in every district closed. So we turned our attention to trying to understand things like whether devices were provided to students or Wi-Fi hotspots so that they could continue to participate in classes last spring. So that involved web scraping and trying some data science techniques to try to figure out whether we could learn these things just from looking at districts' websites. So that was kind of a new project, and that transition to looking at their posts via Facebook and Twitter. It turns out that that's one of the ways that districts communicated kind of just in the moment with stakeholders. So that was a totally new area, but it drew on some experiences and skills that I had already developed. The second is a continuation of an existing project. For an existing National Science Foundation funded study, we were using an experience sampling method technique. And the particular version of the technique that we were using involved sending a text message to undergraduate computer science students. So experience sampling method, as many MOTSIG members will know, can take a number of different forms. A lot of times students or teachers use an application on their phone to respond to these short surveys, these experience sampling prompts or surveys. Other times teachers use like exit tickets or an end of class survey. But we were sending text messages to them and then using their responses to try to figure out what their experiences in class were. And so in that case, we were able to just continue collecting data throughout the spring because we weren't collecting data in a classroom. We weren't needing to shift to collecting through maybe a online survey instead. So in that case, it was kind of a nice attribute of our existing study that we were able to continue data collection without any interruption. And because of that, we could try to find out how students, for example, sense of enjoying class changed from before the pandemic to kind of during the rocky period in March to the period kind of between then and the end of the semester in April and May. So that was an example of sort of right place, right time in the case of that project, right method, I guess. And then the third thing I wanted to say was advice to myself mostly, which is to basically keep on doing what you're doing, not because education's not changing, it is. The kinds of questions that we need to ask are definitely evolving. They're different now because of the pandemic. But if we I think the best way to ask those questions is to extend collaborations, extend studies, extend our theoretical understanding to in ways that are already aligned. So I think where I've been most successful in adapting to the COVID-19 landscape is sort of building on things I've already done or taking advantage of a study that was already was already undergoing. In the case of that experience sampling method survey, rather than trying a whole new area of research. I think that's just hard to do, especially during a pandemic. So my advice to myself is basically keep doing what you have spent time doing, and think about ways where you can contribute, but don't change wholesale to a new area of research in light of the pandemic.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. In line with that, what are some of the recommendations you have for graduate students who are, I guess, the research that they're doing is not quite established yet? And so, what about those who are embarking on new research projects, thinking about participant samples, different data collection strategies, or data analyses that you think might be helpful?
Yeah, good question. Um, so in terms of general things, um, I would say if you're pursuing a dissertation, continue to focus on the things that motivate you, that drive you. Don't feel like you need to shift to a pandemic topic necessarily, but do consider chances to maybe, if you're already collecting data for a study, for a dissertation, think about how the disruptions that the pandemic had brought on might have a bearing on your findings or your questions or your research, but don't feel like you need to change wholesale to a new topic. Um, I think a second thing that comes to mind, this is a little bit different, and this is again pretty general, but I would say as a grad student, you're in this weird position where you are possibly experiencing a stressful situation yourself. You might be having to adapt a class you teach, or you might be having to adapt um, the things that you're doing as a part of a research assistantship. Um, but at the same time, you might have some chances to adapt what you're doing for example, undergraduate students who might be working on the same project you are, or they might be in a class you teach. And so my advice would be to try to find a way to also extend a little bit of flexibility to those that you are working with as well. And I say that with a lot of caution, because I know as a grad student, you're also maybe still being held to the same expectations that you were prior to the pandemic. You still have maybe the same amount of funding, you still have possibly the same responsibilities, but you have a lot of new burdens on top of those. So it's tough to put this on grad students, but I would say when you have chances, think about ways to extend kind of a little bit of flexibility to anyone that you yourself have kind of a position of like being a supervisor for. And I think so that's the second thing I wanted to mention. In terms of specific techniques or studies, I don't really know. Do you have any ideas of promising um, kinds of research that should be done in the present time?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think there's definitely a lot of online learning experiences, research that I think that people are being interested in and trying to learn more about. How do we navigate this online space effectively, and also while with the caveat of understanding all the inequities that are associated with online learning right now, seeing this. Like for example, your grant is working on putting STEM education in rural areas, right? And so I'm from Eastern Kentucky, and I know that like I don't even have Wi-Fi at my house anymore. So like things, trying to navigate the online space, but also understanding the inequities like related to that. Um, as far as, yeah, I think with this whole COVID pandemic, it's hard to foresee like what I would even be. I couldn't imagine doing my own dissertation right now because I just collecting data seems so um, difficult. But there's certainly more tools available to us now. Now that computers are everywhere at this point, there's a lot of online methods to deliver, brief interventions or, for example, your experience sampling methods. So those are things that we can try to navigate to help us with our projects moving forward.
Yeah, um, couldn't agree more with everything that you said.
Yeah.
Uh, I think that as a community, motivation scholars have a lot to offer to conversations about technology in education. So if you've already been doing that kind of work, I think you're well positioned to continue to do it. If you've developed expertise collecting data in other kinds of learning environments or learning environments not using technology, there's chances to think about how the methods you've used or the theories you've drawn on could apply to things like remote learning or synchronous learning. How can motivation theory inform how to carry out an effective Zoom-based class or kind of asynchronous activities? What kinds of things might help maybe throughout the week? Things like staying in touch with students or creating a community online somehow. I think there's a lot to be done in this new period of education. And I love the ideas that you suggested. I think those are important.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Do you have any resources that you think that have been particularly helpful during this time?
Oh, good question. Um, can you say a little bit about what types of resources? Like, are you thinking of like people or yeah?
I think it can kind of be any of the above. We've left it open. We've had some suggestions. I mean, online tools, maybe groups of people, etc.
Yeah. Okay. One thing I've really liked, and some students have said they liked, so evidence from someone other than myself, is having a Slack group for my research team. I would say roughly 2/3 of the messages are about research projects. Can you send me a link to this document? Or just checking in, where do things stand with this survey? But a third of the messages have to do with taking bike rides or gardening or random things that one found and wants to share. And that's been really important because not being on campus, I'm a social person in general, but even if you're not, I think you might miss just the chance to talk to people. And so I think having a Slack group has been really helpful. And I encourage others to find ways to kind of communicate outside of email. Speaking of, to communicate outside of email, I think that's been something that's been really helpful. Having close colleagues too, someone you can just express frustration to or excitement. That's been really important to me. I won't say any names, but I think the people who I'm chatting with throughout the day probably would know that they're part of this kind of support network for me.
Is that something that you just recently kind of like came into, or something you've been using for a really long time?
I think it's something that I was sort of, um, I mean, just factually, I started using Slack with my research group in the fall. I think we used it a lot more during the pandemic because two doc students who I work closely with had offices, or they had an office space right outside of my office. So a lot of times our check-ins would be them knocking on my door or me poking my head in over there, and we just don't have that. And so I
Yeah.
think that all of that kind of got moved into Slack. And there's been some learning with that. Like one thing I'm continually trying myself to do and to encourage students to do is to post messages in channels rather than direct messages to me, because others in the research group can use that as a way to stay kind of apprised of what we're doing. So it's almost like if you're in the office and you just hear others talking about the project, you sort of feel like you're still kind of up to date on it. And so if it's just a message between me and someone else, then others can't really benefit from knowing about the decisions we made or just kind of where things stand with the project. So trying to keep our work kind of public as much as possible within the group has been a helpful thing too.
Yeah, it's so interesting how like the formality changes, even though I don't know, from emails to Slacks are so different, but really
Yes.
they're just different platforms, and they're I don't know, they're just it's weird how we do that.
Well, you mentioned formality. Can you say a little bit more what you mean by that? Because I think I know what you mean, and I think I feel pretty similarly about it.
Yeah. So I think like formality of emails. I mean, I write an email to my professor and it takes me half an hour for some reason. And then if I'm, if it's a quick question, it could be a sentence on Slack that I just send over as opposed to a long drawn out formal dear professor, XYZ best and all these signatures. Um, it's just interesting because technically email could serve in a similar fashion as Slack, right? You copy people on your email, everyone sees it, but because it's a different platform, it's just there's a different feel to it.
I've struggled with this a little bit because with students I work with, like our research group, I feel comfortable being informal and using language like not using correct grammar, I guess, in my messages. Like, check this out, colon,
Yeah.
or something. But I'm using it for a class I'm teaching now too, and I struggle constantly with thinking, if I'm informal, it will sort of communicate with students that this is a space where we can chat in a way that's a little bit more um, just it gives you a chance to feel like you can check in and share your thoughts, and it's not like raising your hand in class. It's more of just a kind of open space. But at the same time, I feel like I don't want them to think that I have sort of a low expectation of how we should communicate with each other and how I should be communicating with them. So I struggle with this too. I know what you mean about sending an email that takes you 30 minutes to write. I can think of messaging dissertation updates to my co-chairs, and it's kind of, would you please consider taking a look at this if you can, possibly in the next time, whenever you're available. And so it goes both ways a little too.
Yeah, for sure. Especially during this time where it's like we are so like yearning for social communication to some degree, and then having that formality, it almost becomes a barrier to how we can engage with others.
I think you're right. And I think that we need to be thinking about how different tools allow us to communicate in different ways, and being okay with that.
Yeah. All right. My next question for you is, what have you learned or changed that will remain a part of your research practice after the pandemic, whenever that comes?
Yeah, whenever that comes. My first thought in response to that good question is that time is really valuable in general. But I think the pandemic has helped me a little bit to maybe at least reflect on how I'm spending my time, because it's like, uh, uh, sorry, let me think about this. So it's especially when I don't have a full work day, um, I have to prioritize certain things. Like for me, it's basically teaching and a class, preparing for a class I'm going to teach, because uh, that's just essential. And then kind of service things that can often be delayed, but sometimes can't. Those have to get done. Um, and then research that has a deadline, that has to get done. So maybe a grant application deadline, or a revision deadline for an article, or a conference proposal deadline. But then like everything else becomes hard to find time for, because once you kind of take out the time for that, if you already have a shortened day, I know um, many find themselves in this situation. You have to choose what to focus on. And so I think something I would take to the time from now to the time after the pandemic is thinking really hard about how I'm spending my time and what I'm focusing on. Um, I think so. It's kind of like experiencing not having enough time to do things has helped me to reevaluate and try to think about what's really important for me to focus on. And I can't say that I've done this. I still spend time learning new methods, or trying out new things when I really should be writing up the results of that article and sending it off. So I still do that, but I have this seed planted now of like, if you have free time, take advantage of that and focus on the most important thing, for your research or for your career, or for the public good, whatever you think is most important to do.
Hmm, interesting. So speaking with that, how have you navigated kind of working from home and this new lifestyle? Um, trying to, I guess, put boundaries between your work and your home life in one space.
Yeah, it's really hard. I don't have any advice. I really don't. When I think advice to myself might be to try to do less because you need time for the other things. And so you can't do the same amount of work that you were um, hoping to do before the pandemic. You have to do less. I think that um, if you can put like a barrier between work and home, I think that's great. At the same time, there's benefits to being able to catch up on email while you're watching TV with your family or something. And so there's a tension there. Like um, on the one hand, I think having more of a separation is healthy. But on the other hand, it might be 8 p.m., 9 p.m. when you can finally work if you have a child at home, for example. So it's really a kind of every situation is a little different. I think if people have good strategies that work for them, I would love to hear more of them. But I don't I don't have many. I don't have many apart from uh, try to focus on the important things and try to adapt and um, yeah. Sorry, I think I've said that already, but
No, I think that's helpful. And like, I think there's some truth to the fact that this is new for everyone. So, um, not even the most productive researcher has it all figured out. So,
yeah, none of it, and in my case, and certainly not the most productive. But yeah, I mean, everyone's personality is different as a researcher, and I think um, like advice um, is good to learn from. Like other people's advice about how to work during the pandemic is one experience that you can take things away from. But I think that everybody's situation is a little bit structured differently, and so yeah, I don't. Let me try to finish this thought. I think that like I think you said it best. We're all trying to figure out how to adapt in this period, and if you can find something that works for you and it works for you for 2 weeks or 2 months or a year, great, roll with it. But if it works for you for 2 weeks and you have to change to something else, that would be closer to my experience. And I would encourage you to keep on trying to find ways that work as we try to get through a really, 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 really challenging time.
well, thank you so much for all your insight. I think this is really helpful, and I'm sure that your advice will spread and people will benefit from it in some way.
In some way, yeah.
If anything, they will learn to make the best out of their situations and understand that everyone has their differences.
I'll take that. I think that's I'll stand behind that.